as I was growing up, once you decide, the only choice you have after that is to be the best at what you do. So I went and got a bachelor's degree, followed by a master's degree, followed by a PhD, and then a very high-paying job, and I made everybody in my family happy, right? And now there is a cost associated with that. So if I have to think of changing things and not being an engineer, there is this whole sunk cost because I've spent time, I've spent energy in being who I was until that point. But who I was at that point was not working for me. So you're at a crossroads and you have to decide, so do I try to keep everyone around me happy and just continue being who I have become? Or do I try to do what makes me happy? And in that way, I make others happy. And that requires a huge change.
Sumitha Bhandarkar was a software engineer in her mid-30s, married with a young daughter. Originally from India, she was now living in Austin, Texas, living the American dream, when her husband had a health crisis that for her was a wake-up call. She realized how jaded and unhappy she'd become, and how much that change was impacting her relationship with both her husband and her daughter. Determined to change, she traced the biggest source of unhappiness back to her career. Yet there were two big barriers to making a career change. One was the amount of sunk costs she had in her career. She had a PhD. She had invested so much time, money, and effort into her work and her education. Plus, this well-paid career was what was expected of her and had won her family's approval. Growing up in a middle-class Indian family, she'd felt she'd had two choices: to become a doctor or an engineer. In our conversation, hear about how Sumitha used a sabbatical break to make her career transition gradually, and in the process discovered a hobby that she was able to turn into a profitable business. Today, Sumitha is the creator of the parenting website afineparent.com and the leader of a 71,000 plus member community of parents who believe that great parents are made, not born. You'll get a lot out of this conversation if you're also in a career that's making you unhappy and you'd love to discover what you're really meant to do. Yet that big change feels especially difficult because of your family's expectations and approval, or the amount of time and money you've already sunk into your education and current career. Sumitha shares her approach to all these challenges, which was incredibly pragmatic and level-headed, as well as being led by her desire and determination to lead a happier life and to make those around her happier too. I'm Lisa Hawashi, and this is Leap Like Me, the show about the leaps people take to make the most of this amazing life. Welcome, Sumitha. Thanks for joining us today.
So happy to be here, Lisa.
Will you tell us where the story of your sabbatical begins?
Okay, so this was back in 2011. I was in my mid-30s, married with a beautiful young daughter and what most people would call a pretty good job. I come from a middle-income family in a third-world country. I was born and raised in India. And here I was in the US, living the American dream and making more money than I ever imagined possible. And by all indications, I should have been happy, but I wasn't. I don't know how to really explain this, but there was this almost persistent, permanent sort of undercurrent of discontentment and disharmony and discord. And during that time, from probably my early 20s to mid 30s, I had somehow gone from a bubbly person full of dreams and enthusiasm to this sort of jaded, cynical, middle-aged person who isn't happy with anything and who's always got a complaint or a cuss word at the tip of her tongue. You know that sort, right? And it wasn't pretty. And I didn't even realize how bad it had gotten. And I would have probably just continued like this for the rest of my life, except there was this very unexpected life event that sort of took all this and threw it in my face. And I had to see what we had become, how far we had got from where we wanted to be. And that sort of set things in motion for me for my sabbatical.
And what was your job at the time? And how do you think it was contributing to this feeling of unhappiness?
So I was working as a software engineer at a pretty big corporation. And when you work for a big company, there really is not a whole lot of control on what you do. And I am kind of the person who gets very passionate about what I do, and I need to be involved, and I need it for it to matter. And in this company, you'd work for like 6 months on a project, and somebody in the upper level management decided that this project was no longer worth it and it would just get scrapped. So everybody would complain when the project got scrapped, and then they would move on to the next project because this was just a way to get a paycheck. But I was seething and I was unhappy and discontent. And I'm like, what am I doing with my life? And it's all such a waste. So that was one side of it. On the other side of it was the whole management was really bad. So they would set unreasonable deadlines and we would have to work on weekends. So there really was no work-life balance, and that was stressing me out. And I think I was in a field where I shouldn't have been to begin with. So all this kind of added up to that sense of not rightness. So it was really starting to grate on everything I did.
And once you had this experience of this sort of moment that was a wake-up call for you, what happened after that?
The way it kind of unfolded, it was a regular day. I was at work. My daughter was in daycare, and I got this call from my husband, and he was at the hospital. But he said, don't worry, it's not a big deal. Everything's fine. They're keeping me here for observation and, that sort of thing. And he sounded perfectly fine on the phone. So I believed him. So I just left a little early from work that day, picked up my daughter. We stopped at an ice cream shop. We picked up some ice cream and we went to the hospital to meet my husband. And we were kind of making a picnic out of it, right? Because at that stage in life, I believe that these things happen to somebody else. We are invincible. We are immortal, right? It just doesn't sink in. My husband just looked perfectly fine. And then the doctor came in, and you see those videos, right, where they lay those dominoes in a line or some kind of a formation, and you push that one domino, and the whole thing starts to collapse.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what happened with us. It's like it just went from bad to worse. My husband was in the hospital for like 2 weeks. About a week of it was in the emergency room. And there was this one point where we still hadn't told our friends. The doctors didn't know whether he would come out of it. And I was sitting there with my 3-year-old, trying to read to her to keep her occupied. The words were swimming, and it just, everything just collapsed. I mean, it was just a implosion of sorts. And my husband's okay now. I mean, he's back home and it's a medically manageable condition. But something like this shifts things in a very fundamental way. And it kind of makes you push the pause button and you're forced to answer the question, what next? And you have a choice at this point. You can either choose to pretend that nothing major happened and you can go back to the old status quo, or you can treat it like a call to action and commit to doing the hard work of turning things around. And I kind of decided to go with the latter option.
So how did that, I mean, I just get such a sense of the emotion of that time and such a profound picture of the dominoes going tick, tick, tick. What was it like to kind of, you mentioned that you paused, and then what was it like to sort of take stock and to start thinking about what could possibly be next for you?
That was not a good place in my life. It was confusion. It was hazy. It was blurry. I just knew we were in a very bad place in my relationship with my husband, in my relationship with my daughter, in my relationship with my work, in my relationship with myself, in my relationship with everybody around me. Things were just not right. It was not a good place. And I knew I was done being there, but I had no clue at that point how to get out, how to turn things around, how to make things right, because you get one life, and we were in our mid-30s, so it was now or never. So we had to turn things around. And I was not okay with the status quo. So figuring that out, trying to decide what to do next, that was really, really hard. And I took a long time. It's one of the things I decided right up front was that my work life would have to change, because I was not at a point, I mean, things were not nice, but I did not want to give up my husband. And my daughter was just 3 years old, but she's a very strong-willed child, and I am a very strong personality. So we ended up with constant power struggles, but I was not willing to give up on my relationship with my daughter. I wanted to turn that around. So those two were non-negotiable. So that left the third thing, which was the work, which was the source of a whole lot of stress that was impacting my relationship with my husband and my daughter. And I knew that had to change. So that's where I started the work. So I started kind of thinking, okay, if I want to change this, how do I want to change this? Do I want to stay in this industry and find a different job? Do I want to find a different industry completely and work for some other company? Do I want to work for myself? Do I want to not work at all? So those are the questions that you just have to answer for yourself, right? So I just went around and round and round in circles until things kind of started to clear out a little bit. And I started to point to one thing at that point, that this job has to go. I was not ready to give it up yet, but eventually this job has to go. So how do I get there? And that was kind of my starting point.
Eventually, you decided that you were going to just take time off.
Right.
How did you land on that solution for yourself?
So one of the things I kind of realized, okay, so a little bit of background here. I come from a middle income family in India. And as I was growing up, we just had two options. If you have half a brain, you either become a doctor or an engineer. So we didn't have more choice than that as I was growing up, right? I mean, things are different now in India, obviously, but when I was growing up, that was the way it was. And my elder sister became a doctor, and my younger sister and I became engineers because we hated it a little less than how much we hated medicine. Can you imagine that? Choosing your career and an entire life path because you hate that option a little less than the only other option that you have on the table. I mean, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
But that was my life. And I kind of realized as I was trying to sort things out that, yes, I have become an engineer, but I don't need to stay an engineer, right? I mean, it's very hard to kind of make that kind of realization, to have that realization that your prior choices, your prior decisions, what you've done before in your life until now does not have to dictate how the rest of your life goes. And it's very, very hard because as I was growing up, once you decide, the only choice you have after that is to be the best at what you do. So I went and got a bachelor's degree, followed by a master's degree, followed by a PhD, and then a very high paying job. And I made everybody in my family happy, right? And now there is a cost associated with that. So if I have to think of changing things and not being an engineer, there is this whole sunk cost because I've spent time, I've spent energy in being who I was until that point. But who I was at that point was not working for me. So you're at a crossroads and you have to decide, so do I try to keep everyone around me happy and just continue being who I have become? Or do I try to do what makes me happy? And in that way, I make others happy. And that requires a huge change. And that's kind of where I was. So that's how I decided that I had to quit my job. So I had to not just move to a different job in the same industry, but to kind of completely get out of this and find a way to use what I'm good at in a more meaningful, more wholesome kind of manner. Does that make sense? So I wanted to do that. So that meant I had to quit my job and move out. But that's scary. I mean, when you've spent years and years and years being who you are, and you are comfortable financially, right? I mean, we were in a good place financially. So to say, I'm going to give up all this, it's almost impossible.
You also have your family's approval at this point. That's really hard to feel like you might let them down in some way.
Right. And cultural background really makes a difference in this because you have a Japanese background, right?
Yeah, I'm a Japanese American, so
right.
I also have the immigrant background.
Exactly. So this whole Asian mindset where you don't quit. When things get hard, you work harder and you get better at it and you get the best at it. You never quit. You just keep getting better and better at what you're doing. So quitting was just a total taboo. I mean, total not something you did unless you failed, because quitting was the equivalent of failure. Quitting was not course correction in the kind of background that I come from. So there was that whole cultural thing looming down on me, and all this made it really, really hard. And that's kind of why I decided to go with the idea of sabbatical, because a sabbatical by definition is short and you try it for a while. And if it works, great. If it doesn't work, you always have this option of going back to work. And that helped calm down that super pragmatic particle part of my brain, that practical piece that says, no, you can't quit a job, or stop trying to swim upstream, it's stupid, or you can't be a quitter, that part of my brain that was sitting there and making all this noise, I could kind of calm it down and I could kind of tame it by saying, hey, it's just a sabbatical. I'm just taking some time off and I'm going to do it responsibly and it's all going to be fine. And if it doesn't work out, I'll come back. So that was my approach to this. I knew all along that I wanted to quit and change course, but I wasn't ready to do it cold turkey. So the sabbatical was kind of a internship kind of period where I could just test drive it. It's like riding a bicycle with training wheels instead of just going out on that big girl bike all at one shot. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that, so this is so intriguing that at this moment and in your particular situation, taking a sabbatical seemed less risky than just sort of leaping and announcing that you're leaving your previous career for another one. It kind of gave you this buffer space where you could more gently ease into it.
Right. And this buffer, I like that word. This buffer was both for myself and for my family, because at the end of the day, my family is not mean. I mean, they're not bad. They're not trying to make me miserable. They don't want me to stay miserable. But at the same time, they're as conditioned into this way of you don't quit, you need to be the best at what you do, you need to have this high-paying job, you need to climb the career ladder. They are as much conditioned as I am. And I had a choice. I either go completely against the grain and fight them and say, I'm going to do this and you better deal with it. Or I could make them turn around with me, take them on the journey with me, because it was difficult for me to get used to the idea that I was actually going to switch from being a career woman to doing something else, right? And I didn't know at that point what that something else would be. I just knew that it had to be something else, right? So making that switch, as hard it was for me, I knew it was as hard for my family, my parents, my husband, my friends, and my sisters. So I kind of started dropping little hints saying, hey, it sounds like a good idea to take a few months off and to kind of, just bring the stress down and kind of calm down, and then start dropping bigger hints saying, hey, you know what? I think I'm actually going to do this kind of thing. And then kind of start talking about real plans. Hey, I'm thinking I should probably do this by the time my daughter starts school. So this was around the time when she was 3 years old. So I started by saying, you know what, by the time she's 4, if I do this, I still get a year with her before she goes to school. And then when I realized that really wasn't happening, then I'm like, you know what, I really am going to do this when she goes into kindergarten, because kindergarten is new for her and I'll be there to, you kind of tie it to open times. You don't set a date saying I'm doing this on April 4th of such and such a year. that's, I don't know, to me at least, that was unreasonable. But at the same time, I needed a timeline to work with. So tying it to some kind of a life event, like, by my 40th birthday or by my 35th birthday or by the time my daughter starts school or by the time I have a baby or, tying it to some kind of a life event makes it real and actually makes it happen. And in my case, that worked out. So by the time my daughter started school, I wanted to be out of that job and to be able to be there for her, to help her with her school and pick her up when her school is done. So at that point, my daughter was in daycare and she went at like 9 a.m. and she stayed there until they closed at 6 p.m. And this little baby was with strangers most of her day. And I didn't want that to continue when she went into school. So I kind of started pitching it from that perspective to myself and my family. And by the time I came around and I was ready financially to do this, I think they were too to support me in this. Some more grudgingly than others, but they did turn around.
Yeah. So I love you taking us through the sort of preparation of when you feel like your family is so tied into your decision of sort of your process of taking them through that. What was it like on the financial side for you in terms of preparation?
So when you make a change like this, it's a big change, right? So there are multiple things to figure out, and it kind of falls in two main categories. One is the tangibles, that is the finances and lifestyle changes, that kind of thing. And the other is the intangibles, which is much more harder, dealing with the emotional aspect of it, the psychological part of it. So I was trying to do both at the same time. And my goal was the intangibles, I may not figure out because there's a whole lot of unknown out there. But the tangibles, I had to get it in order. I'm a control freak. I'm a type A personality. So I can't have unknowns all around me, right? It's like I need to have something sorted out thoroughly.
Right.
So to me, getting my financials in order was a non-negotiable thing again. So I had to get that done before I quit my job. So it actually took me 2 years from the time I started noodling with this idea to actually being able to quit. And some of the things that I did at that time, I think the very first thing I did at that time is to start doing monthly expenses in the written form, right? So I was tracking every single card, every single bank account, every single expense. I didn't do it on a daily basis. I didn't track every expense, but I did it at the macro level where I'd look at my monthly credit card statements and my bank statements. So by the end of the month, I'd have to have a clear idea of how much I was spending each month on average. So there would be ups and downs, but I had to know how much was my expense and what I could trim out of that and try to get things to as low as possible without getting uncomfortable. Because you can keep trimming the fat out, but at one point you're going to hate it. So you don't want to get to that point either, right? So that was the first part. And by then we were already on the path to be almost completely debt free. And that's always been an important thing for both my husband and I to have responsible finances. So being debt free was really, really important because I didn't want that hanging on our head. And then setting up some kind of savings fund. In my case, I called it a salary fund. I know it's kind of hokey and it's kind of cheesy, but that's kind of what I called it. And the idea was to have enough in that account to pay myself a salary for the next 2 years. So if I did not figure out a way to earn an income during my sabbatical, if I just spent it doing other things that I wanted to do, I still should be okay without freaking out because my finances were a mess. Mm-hmm. So I set up a salary fund to pay myself. What I had figured out from my monthly tracking was my monthly expense. So I wanted to be able to pay that much plus a little in that salary account. I had another account for emergencies and incidental expenses. Like I said, my parents are in India. So if I want to take a vacation, the cost of each ticket is anywhere between 1,000 and 1,500. So I didn't want to be deciding that I don't want to go to India because I don't have the money for it because I'm taking the sabbatical, right? Mm-hmm. So because then I start resenting my sabbatical. I didn't want to get into that kind of a fix. And one more important thing was I didn't want to take my sabbatical and end up burdening my husband, because the goal of this whole thing was to reduce the stress, to increase the peace and kind of contentment in our house. And if I just quit my job and stayed at home and told my husband, you take care of everything, it would just increase the stress on him, and that would come out on me, and that would just make things worse again. So that wouldn't solve the purpose. So my goal was to be able to manage every single bill that I was currently paying and to just continue with that. So it takes time. I mean, it took me a whole 2 years to get to that point. But if anybody is looking to do this, I highly, highly, highly recommend getting to this stage if possible, because when I did take the sabbatical, there were a lot of the intangibles, the emotional and the psychological issues that come up that just hit you. And you don't want to deal with these financial things at the same time as you're dealing with them. You don't want these to impact your decisions. In my case, I was able to say, you know what, it's okay if I don't make any money during those 2 years. And it's still fine because I have other things to work on that are more important at this point in my life. And that made a huge difference to me. And if that is important to somebody, I would highly, highly say, take care of the tangibles so you're free to take care of the intangibles during your sabbatical. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That you're really creating space to allow yourself to deal with all those unexpected things that come up emotionally. And that's really about your direction in life.
Exactly.
And just to clarify, so your husband, the idea was that you would take up to 2 years off and your husband would continue working his regular job. Is that right?
So his job is pretty stable and good. So it covered our health insurance and those kind of things. But he would continue to take care of all the bills that he was taking care of before I quit. And I would continue to take care of the bills that I was taking care of. And the only thing that would change because I quit my job was I was no longer contributing to the long-term savings of the family. Does that make sense? And we kind of sat down and we looked at where we were at that point. We had taken care of all our debts, so we didn't have any debts, including mortgage. So at that point, we were working on our long-term savings and retirement accounts and college fund and that kind of thing. So we sat down and we are like, okay, we are in a decent shape that we can take 2 years off without me contributing to that long-term account, and we would still be okay at the end of 2 years. So as long as I did not burden him with day-to-day expenses, we would be perfectly fine. And that's kind of where we decided that it was time to actually do this.
Yeah. Sounds like you guys really thought through that super clearly and stayed in good communication about it.
Yes, because he was one of the people who could not understand my decision because, like I said, he was the one in the hospital, right? So he was the one who had this life-altering experience, and he was willing to go back to work, and he couldn't see why I wanted to do all these changes, right? I mean, so you have to work with each other and try to figure out something that works for both of you. You can't force them to see a point. You just have to make them experience that this is an alternate path that will work for us better. I need you to trust me for a while and we'll get there. Remove any hurdles you can on the way, like finances should not come into that decision anymore because that is sorted out. And what else can you sort out? What else can you figure out to smooth this in a way that your support network is there, right? Because if you try to do this without support network, you just make it exponentially harder because you're dealing with all these really difficult things. And if there are other people who are holding you back, it's just not worth it. So try and sort those things, I would say.
So how do you think that you've done? What would your husband say that he's observed as a change in you?
You should ask him that.
I wish I could.
But so I'm a lists person. So I like making clean lists and I like having a very clear idea of where I'm going. And it's kind of weird that we are going in a direction which is completely unknown. And I'm a person who likes lists and knowing everything, knowing the next 20 steps, right? So I did end up making one list that kind of was my guidepost, and it had 3 points on it. And that was my goals or my expectations from what's going to come out of this, what I want from the sabbatical. And those three things were a better relationship with my husband, a better relationship with my daughter, and a better relationship with my job or career or life's work or whatever you want to call it, right? What I did with my time. And I wanted that to be something meaningful, something useful and wholesome and fulfilling and in line with my values, which is something that my previous corporate job, I was not checking any of those boxes. And the stress was really getting me down and getting in the way of meeting the first two goals, right? So when I did this, I wanted to check off those three boxes. I always wanted to be in line with these three goals: better relationship with husband, better relationship with daughter, and a meaningful kind of thing to do with my life. And within the first 6 months, it was kind of clear that it was making a difference. So because we had these finances figured out, one of the things it was, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I was open to trying out a whole lot of things. And at that time, to improve the relationship with my daughter, I was reading a lot of parenting material. And one of the things that I came across was this philosophy called positive parenting. And that really clicked for my daughter and me. And it was like a dramatic change in our relationship, in the way I dealt with her, in the way we handled those power struggles that were like constant before, but now we did have a few, but it would just fizzle out, right? So I knew that was the direction I wanted to go in for improving my relationship with my daughter. And so I decided to start a site about that. So I'm like, okay, so this is something I do meaningful with my time. It keeps me accountable. And at the same time, I'm sharing what I learned with other people who might be able to benefit from it, right? And because we had these financials figured out, I did not worry about monetizing that site. I'm like, at this point, it's just a hobby. Just focus on getting it right? I mean, it's like just focus on enjoying it, figuring out how you want the site to grow, what kind of a community you want to build around it, and interacting with those other parents that were emailing me. And that kind of really helped in calming things between me and my daughter. And a lot of what I was learning there, I was trying with my husband, and it was helping our relationship. And within kind of the first 6 months, there was a palpable change. I mean, a noticeable change in the level of stress in our whole family, in the level of peace in the household, in the level of contentment, in how much more we were happy in each other's presence instead of snapping at each other all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So within that first 6 months or so, my husband and I started talking about how this was actually helping. And we actually started discussing that by the end of 2 years, if I don't figure out how to monetize this, it's still worth continuing in this path. It's still worth it for me to stay on this path because it was making a huge difference to the quality of life. And we would take a longer term hit and we would rework our financials if it meant that at the end of 2 years, if I hadn't figured out how to turn this hobby into a business, if I didn't want to turn this hobby into a business, if I couldn't turn this hobby into a business, it would still be okay. So that took the pressure off and let me focus on those three goals. And I just worked on that and it had made all the difference.
What was one of the most challenging things that came up for you unexpectedly as you started your time off?
There were a lot of things that kind of came up because for some people, doing the sabbatical, changing the career path, it's just switching from one career to another, and it's simple and sweet, and the whole world is sunshine and rainbows, right? But for many of us, taking the sabbatical is very intricately linked to a journey of self-discovery and introspection. And that can be a really huge emotional roller coaster, right? And if you learn to kind of lean into it, you grow so much, but the challenges that come up are really hard and not easy. And I kind of want to talk about one of those challenges if we have some time. And so I had just quit and I had started my sabbatical. And for the first few months, maybe even a whole of the first year or two after I quit my job, I'd have a really, really rough time after parties and social gatherings. because I'd go there and I'd meet someone new and they'd ask, so what do you do, right? I mean, it just comes as part of your normal introduction conversation. And they'd just say, so what do you do? And I could no longer say I work at such and such a company or I'm an engineer. I didn't have that easy answer. And even when I hung out with old friends who are all engineers and they'd start talking shop, and I didn't have anything to add to the conversation to speak at that point. And then I'd come back home and I'd get hit by this really intense kind of identity crisis because I hadn't realized how much of my identity was tied up to being an engineer and to being a career woman, because that's kind of what I had worked towards my entire life until this point. And I had made the switch and it all looked good on paper, but my brain hadn't caught up to that. Does that kind of make sense?
Totally.
So then I would go into this intense spiral of who am I? What am I? And I had to really dig deep and explore who I was beyond this label. And I had to inspect why it bothered me so much, what I thought others would think of me if I was no longer one of these labels, and why being a high achiever, something that was defined by someone else, why was it so integral to my personal sense of self-worth? And none of these questions are easy, but when you work with them and you challenge yourself to not run away, not hide, but to deal with them, no matter how uncomfortable they make you feel, and no matter how long it takes you, when you deal with those, you come out a different person, a better person, I would think. Because I have come to a stage at this point where I'm a whole lot more comfortable in my own skin and in who I am. I don't need labels to define my self-worth or to prop up my self-esteem. So I can be an editor of a site, or I can be an entrepreneur, or I can be a stay-at-home mom, or I can be whatever label I fancy on any given day and still feel okay with who I am, still feel fine with where I am with life, with the way things are, and not be bothered by other people's judgment. Or most of the time, what we think is other people's judgment of us. They probably don't even care who we are, but we kind of let that affect us. And that was one of the challenges, one of the biggest challenges I had to deal with when I quit my job, and also the biggest area of growth for me personally by taking the sabbatical. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, totally. I mean, you completely reminded me of, I hadn't thought of that in a really long time, of how it felt to answer people's questions at parties after I left my job. I mean, I also had a job that I left, a career that was really kind of all consuming and self-defining. And I did feel this kind of profound emptiness and even kind of a fragility after leaving that. It's like, okay, what's left? And that was pretty scary. And it did take time to be kind of like, okay, I'm still here. And to sort of let those parts of me that had been dormant and maybe starved and eventually, kind of grow and to be more expressed in the world.
Right. So anybody else who's out there who's kind of dealing with this, hang in there. I mean, it's well worth it, because yes, it is an identity crisis. Yes, you don't have the old identity to fall on, but the new identity, the new person that you realize you are, is so much more bigger, open to possibilities, and broader in scope, that it's going to be worth going through this phase of discomfort. So hang in there.
Yeah, it's going to feel a lot better later.
Yes.
Did you ever imagine that you would be an entrepreneur?
Yes and no. So it's something we all dream about, right? It's especially I was a software engineer, and you always dream about having this startup or being the next big thing. you always have these pipe dreams. But if I ever thought of myself as an entrepreneur, I would probably think of being a CEO of a tech company at some point. My definition of entrepreneur wasn't somebody who started a website and kind of turned that into a business. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I did hope I would do something different, hope I would be an entrepreneur sometime, but my definition of entrepreneur has changed dramatically during these 5 years.
And what do you think that the work that you found now, what do you think it's allowed you to express or to use in terms of your skills and strengths that is really different from what you were doing before?
Oh my God. So this is a journey of kind of self-discovery and looking into yourself. And there are so many things I've learned. I'm sure the list could just go on. So some of the things, it's like, so what I do with my time right now, I know it matters. So I can decide what I do in the next hour for it to be useful, for it to feel fruitful, for it to be fulfilling. I think that has been the biggest thing. It's like when I worked at my corporate job before, I was still very good at what I did. You get those bonuses and you go get those accolades, but they didn't mean much. It was just a check mark. And now it's not that kind of accolades or recognition or anything, but even a small thing that I do gives me this, I don't know, soul touching level of deep fulfillment and kind of contentment because I know it matters. Does that kind of make sense? I don't know. I think that came out a little woo-woo, but it matters. It matters to me. It matters to someone out there. It matters to my family. I think that's the biggest thing that's come out of this for me, to be able to use what I'm good at to do things that matter instead of just doing the rote things because somebody in the upper management decides that that needs to be done at this point. And that could get scrapped at any given point.
It sounds like you found some work that brings you a lot closer to feeling like you have an impact or being able to really actually experience the fact that you've had an impact.
Right. That's very well said.
Well, to wrap up our conversation, I want to ask you 3 rapid fire questions.
Sure.
So the first question is, what do you wish you had known before you took your leap?
That it'll all be okay. That things will eventually work out as long as you keep an open mind and don't give up.
What was the most unexpected thing to come of your leap?
A lot of self-discovery. So I thought I was going to have a better relationship with my husband and daughter, but what I have found is that I now have a very different level of comfort and confidence in my own skin, in my relationships, not just with my husband and daughter, but with everyone around me, whether it's personal or professional. A level of comfort and confidence in the way I run my business, in turning what was a hobby into something that earns an income without selling my soul, and feeling that level of comfort and confidence. I didn't know it was possible to get to this point as I'm feeling at the moment.
Wow. Yeah. For someone who's thinking of doing something similar, what one piece of advice would you offer them?
Oh, okay. So here I'm going to borrow Nike's tagline, and that's just do it, right? Think of it as a sabbatical, as something short, as something for a few months, for a year, for 2 years, whatever feels comfortable for you, and just do it, because a few months, a year, 2 years is not a long time in the context of a lifespan. It's really very short. The worst case is that you'll decide this is not for you and you'll just go back to your old work. At least you've tried something different and at least you've got a break, right? But if things work out, amazing things can come out of this. It can completely transform your life. It can transform the life of those around you. And you can have an impact on the bigger, broader world out there. So I would say just do it. Just make that leap.
Sumitha, I think you also can really speak on one other area of advice as well. And what could you say to encourage the people who really feel that fear about upsetting people in their life that they really don't want to disappoint? What piece of advice would you give to them?
This is what I found out. Nobody is trying to intentionally be mean to you. Nobody wants you to be miserable. So if they want you to stick with a career path, or if they expect something from you, it's because they are conditioned, just as you were before, to believe in that a certain path is right? Especially if you come from an immigrant background like me. You've done all this to change the path and to come here so you can have a better life than the ones we had. That's what my parents would say, right? So why would you want to give all that up? So they are not trying to intentionally hold you down. They are just acting from a place of their conditioning. So I would suggest that if you're worried about disappointing them, instead of trying to stand up to them and trying to prove a point, try to work with them and get them to see a point. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not even going to happen in a few weeks or a month. It could take years. You might have to start your sabbatical without their support, but don't ever try to do this as a way to prove them wrong, because that's not the right place to come at it from, at least the way I experience it. When you come at it from, this is right for me, and I'd like you to see it because I know you want to be happy for me, and I know you want me to be happy, and this is what makes me happy. And here's why I'm happier now. After you've taken that sabbatical, you show them, here's why this is making a difference to me. And when you approach it from that angle, they will come around. It'll take longer in terms of some people, a very long time, maybe in cases of a few people, but it's still worth approaching it from that angle than from the angle of, I'm going to prove you right or I'm going to prove you wrong. And never let the fear of other people's expectations change you or stop you or make you not take the leap. You do what you have to do, but you approach it from an angle of bringing them along on your journey. I mean, a funny thing out here, it's like we are at a stage right now where my sister, who has completely different financial perspective, completely different financial goals, and who I would think would never quit her job, is actually considering doing this. She's still really, really scared. She'll probably take a few more years. I'm hoping she would do it next year. She wants to do it next year, but I don't think she's ready yet. So it'll happen. It's like people will come around, they'll see, it works out.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm incredibly moved just to hear those insights and that wisdom. And I really appreciate you sharing your story and your thoughts with us today.
I was happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Lisa.
My pleasure. So if people want to stay in touch with you or learn more about your work, how can they do that?
I run the website afineparent.com. And if you're a parent, I'd love for you to join me and our community. We are all at different stages of trying to be responsible, intentional parents, to embrace this positive parenting philosophy. So if that's kind of something that you like, I invite you to come and join me there. I also host a free annual online conference called the Positive Parenting Conference, where I interview authors of popular books in parenting, psychology, personal development, that sort of thing. And we try to suss out what are some of the practical day-to-day things we can do to raise happy, well-adjusted kids, responsible kids, capable kids, right? So if that's kind of what you're interested in, I invite you to come and join us for our next conference. Each of these talks, the interviews, we call them talks, are kind of masterclass quality, and you get them for free. And the next event is in May of 2019. But if you go to my site, that is afineparent.com, you have links there to look at the past 2 years' conferences. So I invite you to join me there. And if you're not a parent and if you want to talk to me about sabbaticals and, making your own switch in your life, you can just email me. I'm Sumitha at afineparent.com.
Great. And we'll include that in our show notes for today's episode.
Sure. Sounds like a plan.
Terrific. All right. Well, thank you again. And
thanks, Lisa. This was a lovely trip down memory lane for me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Head on over to lisahawashi.com for today's show notes and check out the resources that Sumitha has provided there, both about taking a sabbatical and how you can connect with her. It has been such a blast to launch this podcast with this first season of Sabbatical Stories. Thank you to all of you who have become loyal supporters and listeners. It's been wonderful to connect with you in this way. I want to give you a heads up that I am beginning to anticipate taking a break around the end of the year and beginning to plan and record new stories for the second season, which will be focused on people who have taken an amazing career leap. If you know of someone special that you'd like to hear on the show, please do send them my way. Just drop me an email or a message on Facebook or Instagram to let me know your idea. And stay tuned for further updates about that second season. Thanks again for listening to Leap Like Me.